The golden chess piece felt heavier than it should in Vincent's calloused hands, its weight somehow carrying more than mere metal. Around him, crystal glasses clinked against a soundtrack of nervous laughter from men in $1,000 suits. But his eyes stayed fixed on the board, and on the woman standing behind his opponent, whose face had drained of all color. "Win this and I'll give you 100 pemelcens," Preston Blackwell had announced to the room full of his wealthy friends, his voice dripping with the kind of amusement reserved for watching ants navigate around obstacles. The billionaire's manicured fingers drummed against the marble table, each tap echoing like a countdown timer. But when Vincent Torres, factory worker, single father, man whose work boots had never touched floors this pristine, smiled quietly and moved his first piece, something shifted in the air. The woman behind Blackwell's shoulder reached for her phone with trembling fingers. 3 months earlier, Vincent Torres had been staring at a stack of medical bills that seemed to grow taller every time he looked away. His 8-year-old son Lucas lay in the hospital bed, recovering from his 3rd surgery in 6 months, and the insurance company had just denied their latest claim. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the paperwork that threatened to bury their small family in debt. "Dad, are you okay?" Lucas had asked, his small voice cutting through the fog of worry that surrounded Vincent like a suffocating blanket. The boy's eyes held that peculiar wisdom that comes from spending too much time in hospital rooms, understanding things no child should have to understand. Vincent had forced a smile, tucking the bills into his jacket pocket, where Lucas couldn't see the red ink stamped across every page. "Just thinking about work, buddy. Nothing for you to worry about." But they both knew he was lying. The factory where Vincent had worked for 12 years was cutting shifts, and his take-home pay barely covered rent, let alone the mounting medical expenses that seemed to multiply like weeds in their mailbox. That night, after Lucas had fallen asleep clutching his worn teddy bear, Vincent sat alone in their small apartment kitchen. The walls were thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Patterson next door watching her late-night game shows, the familiar sounds of normal people living normal lives. He pulled out his laptop, a refurbished model from 2015 that took forever to start up, and began searching for anything that might help. Side jobs, second mortgages, loan applications he'd already been rejected for twice. Then he saw it. A small article buried in the local news section about Preston Blackwell, the tech billionaire who'd made his fortune developing social media algorithms. Blackwell was hosting what he called entertainment evenings at his mansion in the hills, where wealthy guests would watch him challenge ordinary people to various competitions. The prize money varied, but it was always substantial, always life-changing, and always accompanied by Blackwell's signature condescending commentary about the fascinating behavioral patterns of the working class. Vincent stared at the screen until his eyes burned. He knew he shouldn't even consider it. The whole thing sounded like a rich man's twisted game show, designed to humiliate people desperate enough to participate. But then he thought about Lucas asking if they were going to lose their home, and the question he'd been too afraid to answer honestly. The next morning, Vincent did something he hadn't done in 23 years. He drove to his old high school and asked to see his chess trophies in the display case outside the principal's office. They were still there, gathering dust behind smudged glass. State champion, 1999. Regional champion, 2000. National semi-finalist, 2001. The brass nameplate read Vincent Torres in neat block letters, but it felt like looking at artifacts from someone else's life. "Mr. Torres?" The current principal, a woman young enough to be his daughter, approached with curiosity written across her features. "I remember reading about your victories in the old yearbooks. You were quite the sensation back then." Vincent nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He'd walked away from competitive chess after his father's death, choosing stability over ambition, a steady paycheck over the uncertain world of professional gaming. It had seemed like the responsible choice at the time, the adult choice. But standing there, looking at those forgotten trophies, he wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. "Do you still play?" she asked. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Online mostly, late at night when I can't sleep." What he didn't mention was that he'd been playing under an assumed name for years, racking up victories against opponents who had no idea they were facing a former prodigy. It was his secret vice, his connection to the person he used to be before life demanded he become someone else entirely. That evening, Vincent made the call. Blackwell's assistant, a woman with a voice like polished steel, took his information with professional disinterest. Name, occupation, reason for wanting to participate. When Vincent mentioned his factory job and his son's medical situation, he could practically hear her typing notes into whatever database they maintained of desperate people willing to perform for money. "Mr. Blackwell will review your application," she said. "If selected, you'll receive instructions within 48 hours. Please note that all participants must sign extensive liability waivers, and payment is contingent upon completion of the agreed-upon challenge." 2 days later, the call came. Vincent was selected for what they called a intellectual challenge evening. The prize, $100 million. The cost of losing, public humiliation broadcast to Blackwell's social media followers. The game, chess. Vincent hung up the phone and stared at his hands. They were the hands of a factory worker now, scarred from years of manual labor, calloused from holding tools instead of chess pieces. But muscle memory ran deeper than scars, and somewhere beneath the rough skin was the touch that had once moved pieces across boards in tournaments across 3 states. He spent the next week preparing in ways that had nothing to do with chess strategy. He practiced staying calm under pressure, maintaining eye contact with people who looked at him like he was a curiosity rather than a person. He researched Preston Blackwell, learning about the man's history of turning other people's struggles into entertainment for his wealthy friends. Most importantly, he didn't tell Lucas what he was planning. The boy had enough to worry about without knowing his father was about to risk everything on a game. The night before the challenge, Vincent sat in Lucas's hospital room and watched his son sleep. The machines around the bed hummed quietly, monitoring vitals that had become as familiar to Vincent as his own heartbeat. He thought about all the choices that had led him here, all the roads not taken that had somehow converged on this single moment. "I'm going to fix this," he whispered to the sleeping boy. "Whatever it takes." The mansion in the hills looked exactly like what Vincent had expected from a tech billionaire with more money than sense. Glass and steel jutted from the hillside like geometric crystals, reflecting the city lights below in fractured patterns. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms took his truck keys without judgment, though Vincent caught the subtle glances they exchanged. He was clearly not the usual guest. Inside, the party was already in full swing. Men in custom suits clustered around a bar that probably cost more than Vincent's annual salary, their conversation a mixture of stock tips and gossip about people Vincent had only seen in magazines. The women moved through the crowd like elegant sharks, their jewelry catching the light from chandeliers that belonged in museums. And there, in the center of it all, stood Preston Blackwell. He was smaller than Vincent had expected, with the kind of perfectly maintained appearance that came from armies of personal trainers, nutritionists, and stylists. His smile was wide and practiced, the expression of someone who'd learned early that charm could be weaponized just as effectively as cruelty. "Our guest of honor arrives," Blackwell announced as Vincent entered the main room. His voice carried across the space with theatrical projection, causing conversations to pause as dozens of eyes turned toward the factory worker in his best shirt and only tie. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Vincent Torres, who believes he can outwit a computer algorithm designer at the ultimate game of strategy." Laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of polite amusement that wealthy people reserved for entertainment they considered beneath them but amusing enough to watch. Vincent felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his expression neutral. He'd expected this, prepared for it even. "Just here to play chess, Mr. Blackwell," Vincent replied evenly. "Of course you are," Blackwell said, his grin widening. "And I admire that. Simple goals for simple people. It's refreshing, really." He gestured toward an ornate chess set positioned on a marble table at the center of the room. The pieces were carved from what looked like genuine ivory and obsidian, each one probably worth more than Vincent made in a month. As they took their seats, Vincent noticed the woman standing behind Blackwell's chair. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Unlike the other guests, she wasn't watching Vincent with amusement or curiosity. Her expression was focused, professional, and somehow familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. "The rules are simple," Blackwell continued, his voice now carrying the cadence of a practiced performer. "Standard chess. No time limits, though I doubt our friend here will need much time to make his moves." More laughter from the audience. "Winner takes all. $100 million for the working man if he can somehow manage to beat me. When he loses, well, he goes back to his factory with a good story and a bruised ego." Vincent nodded and extended his hand across the board. Blackwell's handshake was firm but brief, the grip of someone who calculated even casual contact for maximum effect. "You have white," Blackwell said generously. "First move advantage, you'll need every help you can get." Vincent studied the board for a moment, his fingers hovering over the pieces. The ivory felt smooth and cool beneath his touch, perfectly balanced in a way that reminded him of the tournament sets from his youth. Around them, the crowd had grown quiet, phones appearing as guests prepared to document what they assumed would be a brief and embarrassing defeat. He moved his king's pawn forward 2 spaces. A classic opening, simple and unremarkable. The kind of move an amateur might make, someone who'd learned chess from books or online tutorials rather than years of serious study. Blackwell's response was immediate and confident, his knight leaping forward in a perfectly orthodox development. "Interesting choice," he said loudly enough for the audience to hear. "The king's pawn opening. Very traditional. Did you learn that from your father, perhaps? Or was it one of those Learn Chess in 10 Days books?" Vincent didn't respond. He was studying the board, but more importantly, he was studying his opponent. Blackwell played quickly, confidently, making moves that were technically sound, but lacking the subtle positional understanding that separated good players from great ones. He was exactly what Vincent had hoped, a strong amateur who'd convinced himself he was a master. The woman behind Blackwell shifted slightly, and Vincent caught her eye for just a moment. There was something in her gaze that didn't match the rest of the room's atmosphere of cruel entertainment. She looked concerned, though Vincent couldn't tell if her worry was for him or for something else entirely. As the game progressed, Vincent began to reveal layers of his true skill. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, and might have made Blackwell suspicious. Instead, he let his moves become gradually more sophisticated, each decision revealing a deeper understanding of chess theory than his factory worker persona suggested. By the 15th move, the laughter from the audience had begun to fade. By the 20th, several of the guests were leaning forward, studying the board with newfound interest. Blackwell's confident commentary had become less frequent, replaced by longer periods of consideration before each move. "You're better than you let on," Blackwell said quietly, his voice no longer pitched for the audience. There was something dangerous in his tone now, the sound of a man who didn't like being surprised. "I've played a few games," Vincent replied mildly. The woman behind Blackwell was now openly staring at Vincent, her professional composure cracking slightly. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, her fingers flying across the screen with urgent precision. By the 30th move, it was clear to anyone who understood chess that Vincent was not just holding his own, he was winning. His pieces occupied commanding positions across the board, while Blackwell's forces had been systematically maneuvered into increasingly passive roles. The billionaire's face had lost its confident smirk, replaced by the focused concentration of someone realizing they were in serious trouble. "Who are you?" Blackwell asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the room. Vincent looked up from the board, meeting the billionaire's eyes directly for the first time all evening. "I'm exactly who I said I was. A factory worker trying to help his son." "No," Blackwell said, shaking his head. "Factory workers don't play like this. This is master-level chess. This is—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. "Torres, Vincent Torres. You were the kid from the national championships in 2001, the one who disappeared from competitive play." The room erupted in whispers as guests pulled out phones and began searching for information. Vincent could see screens lighting up around him, displaying articles and photographs from his tournament days. 23-year-old images of a younger version of himself, holding trophies and shaking hands with chess legends. "You lied," Blackwell said, his voice rising with indignation. "You presented yourself as some desperate amateur when you're actually a chess prodigy. This whole thing is fraudulent." "I never lied about anything," Vincent replied calmly. "I told you exactly what I am. A factory worker with a sick son who needs help. The fact that I used to play chess competitively doesn't change that." The woman behind Blackwell stepped forward, her phone now pressed against her ear. Vincent could hear her speaking in rapid, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Words like "confirmed" and "proceed" drifted across the suddenly electric atmosphere of the room. Blackwell's face had gone pale, but his eyes burned with fury. "You think you're clever, don't you? Coming into my home, deceiving me and my guests, making us all look like fools." "I came here to play chess for money to help my son," Vincent said, his voice remaining steady despite the tension crackling around them. "That's all this was ever about." "Well, congratulations," Blackwell snarled. "You've certainly demonstrated your superior intellect. But let me tell you something about the real world, factory boy. Chess games don't pay medical bills. Moral victories don't keep the lights on. You can beat me at this silly game, but I'll still be a billionaire tomorrow, and you'll still be nobody." The words hit Vincent like physical blows, each one designed to cut deep into the insecurities he'd carried for 23 years. The choice to abandon competitive chess for stability, the years of wondering what might have been, the daily reminder that he'd traded his dreams for what he thought was security. But before he could respond, the woman stepped fully into view, and Vincent finally understood why she'd seemed familiar. She was older now, her face leaner and more serious than in the photographs he'd studied, but he recognized her from the business section of newspapers and financial websites. "Preston Blackwell," she said clearly, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "You're under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The room exploded into chaos as federal agents seemed to materialize from everywhere at once. They'd been posing as catering staff, security personnel, even guests, their careful surveillance finally culminating in this moment. The woman, Agent Cassandra Reynolds, as her badge identified her, began reading Blackwell his rights, while other agents moved to secure the exits and begin processing the scene. Vincent sat frozen at the chessboard, his mind struggling to process what was happening around him. The game that had seemed like the most important moment of his life was suddenly irrelevant. overshadowed by an investigation that had apparently been months in the making. "Mr. Torres." Agent Reynolds approached him as Blackwell was led away in handcuffs, his protests about lawyers and connections echoing through the now chaotic mansion. "I apologize for the deception, but we needed tonight's event to proceed normally, to capture specific evidence of Mr. Blackwell's illegal activities." "I don't understand," Vincent said, his voice sounding hollow in his own ears. "What does any of this have to do with me?" "Nothing, directly," Reynolds assured him. "But your participation tonight provided the perfect cover for our operation. We've been tracking Blackwell's financial crimes for 18 months. These entertainment evenings weren't just cruel games. They were money laundering operations, ways to move illegal funds through fake gambling losses and staged competitions." She gestured toward the chess set, where the ivory pieces still sat frozen in their endgame positions. Every dollar Blackwell claimed to be offering as prize money was actually stolen from pension funds and charitable organizations. The man you were playing against has defrauded thousands of people out of their life savings. Vincent stared at the board, at the game he'd been winning before the world turned upside down. "So there never was any $100 million. "Oh, there was," Reynolds said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But it belonged to the teacher's retirement fund in Ohio, not to Preston Blackwell. We'll be returning it to its rightful owners as part of the asset recovery process." The mansion was rapidly emptying as agents escorted guests out for questioning and evidence collection. Vincent found himself alone with Reynolds in the vast room that had so recently been filled with cruel laughter and desperate hope. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you go home to your son," she said gently. "And you might want to check your bank account in a few days. The FBI has a discretionary fund for civilians who assist in major fraud investigations, especially when those civilians have compelling personal circumstances." Vincent's eyes widened. "I didn't assist in anything. I just came here to play chess." "You provided crucial cover for our operation," Reynolds explained. "And your presence here tonight directly led to Blackwell's capture. The Bureau considers that assistance worth compensating." She handed him a business card with her contact information. "It won't be $100 million, Mr. Torres, but it should be enough to cover your son's medical expenses and then some." As Vincent drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, his mind struggled to process everything that had happened. He'd gone to that mansion prepared to risk his dignity for a chance to help his son. Instead, he'd stumbled into the middle of a federal investigation and somehow emerged as an inadvertent hero in a story much larger than his own struggles. The hospital was quiet when he arrived at Lucas's room. His son was awake, staring out the window at the first hints of sunrise, painting the sky pink and gold. "Dad?" Lucas turned as Vincent entered. "You're here early. Did something happen?" Vincent sat down at the familiar chair beside the bed, the same chair where he'd spent countless hours reading stories and helping with homework and trying to stay strong when everything felt like it was falling apart. "Something did happen," he said carefully. "But it's good news. Really good news." He told Lucas an edited version of the night's events, focusing on the chess game and leaving out the parts about federal investigations and billionaire criminals. To an 8-year-old recovering from surgery, the important part was simple. Dad had played chess and won enough money to pay for medical bills and maybe even a new house. "Does this mean I can come home soon?" Lucas asked, his eyes bright with hope. "The doctors still need to make sure you're completely healed," Vincent said. "But yes, buddy, you can come home soon. And when you do, maybe I can teach you to play chess." Lucas grinned, the first truly carefree smile Vincent had seen from him in months. "Can you teach me to be as good as you?" Vincent thought about that question, about the path that had led him from chess prodigy to factory worker to reluctant federal witness. about the choices that seemed wrong at the time, but had somehow led him exactly where he needed to be. "I can teach you something better than being good at chess," he said finally. "I can teach you to be good at being yourself, no matter what game you're playing." 3 months later, Vincent stood in the doorway of Lucas's new bedroom in their new house. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe and theirs. His son was sitting at a small desk, studying a beginner's chess book with the intense concentration he brought to everything that interested him. "Dad," Lucas called without looking up, "is it true that chess masters can see 20 moves ahead?" "Some can," Vincent replied, "but the best players I've known weren't the ones who could calculate the furthest into the future. They were the ones who understood that every move matters, even when you can't see where it's leading." Lucas nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "Like when you went to play that man in the big house?" "Exactly like that," Vincent said. He'd never told Lucas the full story of that night, and he probably never would. Some truths were too complicated for children, too wrapped up in adult failures and moral ambiguities. But the essential truth was simple enough. Sometimes taking a risk for the right reasons led to consequences you could never have imagined, most of them good. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Vincent went to answer it, finding Agent Reynolds on his doorstep holding a manila folder. "Mr. Torres," she said with a warm smile, "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I wanted to deliver this personally." She handed him the folder, which contained official documents from the FBI's asset recovery program. Vincent scanned the papers, his eyes widening as he processed the numbers. "This is too much," he said. "I can't accept this." "The Bureau disagrees," Reynolds replied. "Your presence at that chess game wasn't just helpful, it was essential to our case. Blackwell's lawyers tried every trick in the book to get the charges dismissed, but the evidence we gathered that night was irrefutable. Dozens of fraud victims are getting their money back because of what happened in that room." She gestured toward the house behind him, where Lucas could be heard practicing chess problems aloud. "Besides, the money comes with one condition." "What's that?" "The local community center has been asking for a volunteer chess instructor for their after-school program. Seems they heard about a former state champion who might be willing to teach kids from families that can't afford private lessons." Vincent felt something shift in his chest, a piece of himself that had been locked away for 23 years suddenly clicking into place. "You want me to teach chess? I want you to do whatever feels right," Reynolds said. "But yes, there are a lot of kids in this city who could benefit from learning that every move matters, even when you can't see where it's leading." After she left, Vincent stood in his living room holding the folder that represented more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. But somehow that wasn't the most important thing he'd received. For the first time in more than 2 decades, he could see a path forward that honored both the man he used to be and the man he'd become. That evening, he called the community center and volunteered to start a chess program. Within a week, he had 12 students ranging in age from 7 to 16, all eager to learn the game that had saved their teacher's life in ways he was only beginning to understand. 6 months later, Vincent's chess club had grown to 40 students. They met twice a week in a room donated by the community center, playing on sets purchased with money from Vincent's federal compensation. The walls were covered with notation sheets and tournament announcements, but also with photos of the students at their first competitions, grinning proudly over their boards regardless of whether they'd won or lost. Lucas, now fully recovered and back to being a normal kid who happened to have an unusual number of interesting scars, had become one of the program's most dedicated students. Not because he was naturally gifted at chess, though he showed promise, but because he understood something his father had taught him about the difference between playing games and playing with honor. Mr. Torres, one of his students, a 10-year-old girl named Maya, approached him after a particularly intense lesson on endgame theory. "My mom wants to know if you're going to enter any tournaments yourself." Vincent considered the question. He'd been asked similar things before, by parents and students, and even by Agent Reynolds, who'd become something of a friend over the months since Blackwell's arrest. The former billionaire was now serving 15 years in federal prison, his assets distributed among the victims of his various schemes. "I might," Vincent said honestly. "But not for the reasons I used to play. If I compete again, it'll be to show you guys that it's never too late to pick up something you loved and do it better than you did before." Maya nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Like a comeback story?" "Something like that," Vincent agreed. That night, after all the students had gone home and the community center had grown quiet, Vincent sat alone at one of the chessboards and played through the game he'd started that night at Preston Blackwell's mansion. The game that had been interrupted by federal agents and transformed from a desperate gamble into the first move in a completely different kind of life. He'd never gotten to finish that game, never gotten to deliver the checkmate that had been only 3 moves away. But as he sat there in the quiet room, surrounded by evidence of second chances and new beginnings, Vincent realized he'd won something far more valuable than any prize money. He'd won himself back. The last move he placed on the board that night wasn't from the unfinished game against Blackwell. It was the opening move of a new game entirely, one where the stakes weren't money or pride or proving anything to anyone else. This time, he was playing for the simple joy of seeing how beautiful the game could be when you played it with an open heart and clear conscience. And for the first time in 23 years, Vincent Torres knew exactly what his next move would be.